Senator David Hann, the chair of the Senate Health and Human Services Committee, has been very vocal in his opposition to the Federal Health Care Act and on the health insurance exchange. Well, he joins me right now to talk about the new leadership for the Exchange Advisory Task Force and a little bit more about what he's hearing from the public on this issue. Thanks for joining us today, Senator.
Glad to be here.
Let's begin with Commissioner Jim Schowalter from Minnesota Management and Budget. He is now leading that advisory task force. What do you think that the commissioner brings to the table?
Well, I think Commissioner Schowalter is certainly an experienced person in government. He was a part of the Pawlenty administration, so I think in many respects he has a little bit more of a bipartisan approach to the work that he's done in various departments of state government. I think he's well respected by people on both sides, and I think, in my view, I think we'll see what happens, but I think it's certainly a step forward from the standpoint of trying to bring some greater transparency, shed some greater light on this whole process. So I welcome the change.
And you were quoted in the September 24th St. Paul Legal Ledger Capital Report. Maybe what this signals is a desire to take this more seriously as a policy matter and to attempt to see if there's a way to do something positive with it. So how would you like to see things going forward, and kind of compare how it was and maybe how you, again,
well,
how you envision it?
I think, again, people should remember that this federal law, of which the exchange is only a part, was a very, very partisan federal law. One of the most partisan bills ever passed, had no Republican support, has been broadly opposed by the public ever since its passage, is still broadly opposed. It's an issue in the national elections. Its future is uncertain, and I think as a matter of practice trying to implement something like that, you're going to face a lot of hurdles. And I think that the way that this has been approached at the state level, at least in Minnesota, has been to continue that very partisan approach. And I don't know that that's been very successful. To me, one of the cardinal problems with this has been the administration has not come forward and said, here are the specific problems for which an exchange is the solution or the exchange is the answer. Instead, they've come forward and said, well, we're going to do this, and we have to do it because the federal law says we have to do it, and we're just going to push this through, and we've created this committee, and we're going to have these meetings, and we're going to do these things, but the results of those meetings and the things that are being talked about are been held very close, and no one really knows what is being talked about or what agreements are being reached. There has been no legislation that has been proposed. So there's a lot of unknowns about what is exactly going to be proposed by the administration and what the problem that is going to be resolved by this exchange. I think that's the key. And what I hope is with the change that Commissioner Schowalter will sit down and let the public see what the administration has in mind. We'll actually produce some legislation and also talk about here are the problems that we see that this particular solution will help. That's what's missing.
Well, the recommendations on the exchange are due shortly, in maybe a little over a month. So what level of involvement have you had thus far in this task force, this advisory task force, and would you like to see your involvement maybe increase as this deadline gets closer?
Well, the deadline that is being talked about is a framework, they call it a blueprint, and there are a number of things that have to be reported to the federal government to sort of show to them that we are on track. And of course, a lot of this is going to hinge on what happens at the federal level in the election. Depending on who's elected, I think we're going to continue down the path, or perhaps it's going to be put on hold and sent back to Congress for some further review. So whatever happens, we'll see. But the thing that's due after the election is a report to show that we are on track, and there's a number of things, I've forgotten how many, quite a number of things that have to be acknowledged or reported on. And we're going to produce, according to the commissioner, some report to show our progress on those issues. What they've told us, and I believe that they're telling us the truth, is that these things are not substantive, they're not policy, they're not telling us what the governing structure is going to look like, they're not telling us what the form of revenue is going to be raised to pay for this. They're staying away from all the controversial, substantive issues that surround the exchange. What they're really talking about reporting is, here are the things that we've put in place that if we're going to go down this path, here's how we're going to do it. It's sort of the technical framework to implement an exchange. That's what they're talking about doing. So those are the things that they are preparing to report, as I understand it.
What are you hearing from Minnesotans on this entire issue as you're out knocking knocking on doors this campaign season?
Actually, very little. I think that for the most part, ordinary citizens are pretty far removed from the direct effects of this. This is, to me, an indication of a problem that hasn't been well defined. The people that I hear mostly from on this issue are people who are selling insurance agents who are very concerned about this because they see this as a direct threat to their ability to do business. And I also hear about it from people who are in the insurance industry themselves, the insurance plans, who also see this as a potential threat to the private insurance business. So I think the industry and the agents are concerned because they are looking at whatever may happen and the uncertainty about it as a potential threat to their business. And I think they are concerned, but most ordinary people, ordinary citizens who don't get immersed in the minutiae of insurance policy, this has not risen to the level yet of being a concern, but it will.
And Senator, if you were to give perhaps one piece of advice to this advisory task force creating the exchange, what would it be at this point? I
would say write a bill. I would say the way that we need to do this in the legislature and the way that it would be helpful to the public is to take the ideas that you're thinking about, put them into a language of a bill, put it before the public, get it in front of a committee, and let's have hearings on it. That's how we should do this. It's one thing to talk about things in broad generalities. You hear these things all the time. And exchanges like, Expedia or, buying things online. Those things they all sound good. Everybody can kind of nod their head and say, yeah, we agree with that. But it's very, very far removed from what it's actually going to look like. And until you see a bill that specifies how things get done, who makes decisions, how it's going to get paid for, how it is governed, until you see those things defined in law, and until you have an opportunity for people who are going to be affected by those decisions to come and testify and say, this is how it's going to affect my life or my business, and have that debate in a hearing, that's when the rubber meets the road, that's when the details are spelled out, and that's where you really get a chance to decide whether this is going to work or not, and that's what we need.
And so what's your advice then for Minnesotans as this process moves forward?
I would say pay attention and be aware of this. And I would also say that to the extent that they are willing to engage at this point, I've always argued for the principle that we need to make sure that decisions about things like health care be made in Minnesota. It's one of the things I think that is troubling about the federal law. When you make decisions in Washington, D.C. that are going to dictate to the people of this state on how we're going to buy insurance or the prices we're going to pay or the things that we're going to have to put in place as far as the relationships between us and our doctors, when you make those decisions in Washington and they don't turn out so well, it's practically impossible to change them. I think that we need to make policy on health care and an insurance regulation here in Minnesota, and we need to do everything we can to preserve that decision making here.
Isn't that kind of what's being done though with this task force? Aren't they trying to get a step ahead and make it so that it's conducive to Minnesotans?
If the federal law says here's what you have to do and they give you guidelines and then they say, all right, now you can make your exchange within those guidelines, it's sort of, well, yes and no. It's kind of like when the federal government says in education policy, here's the rules on No Child Left Behind and you can, implement the policy as long as you follow those rules. Yes, it's a question of, it's Medicaid, another federal policy. You can implement Medicaid, but you have to follow our rules. There's always that tension between the federal government saying, here's what you have to do, and how much flexibility do you really have under those rules? I think the fundamental question is, does the federal government have the primary responsibility to make those rules in the first place? And I would argue they don't, and that is really the central part of this debate.
Okay, with those words, Senator David Hann, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Good to be here.